Okay, thank you for coming to the most recent episode of the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews. Well, today with me, I have Matt from the Feral Historian YouTube channel and Substack. Matt is a really great creator who makes a lot of great videos about the intersection of sci-fi and politics. Matt, do you want to jump into it, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your history, the type of work you do?
Well, the work I do, it's primarily a YouTube channel looking at science fiction over the last, well, I guess it really is the last 100 years now. Reached all the way back to some H.G. Wells stuff and kind of looking at it in terms of cultural artifacts, because those are really the stories of our time. They're the modern literature, whether or not we're talking about books or films or television series, even where it's really long form storytelling that reflects the world that produced it. And some of the ideas that are churning around at the time. And with long running series like Star Trek, for example, we get this cross section of the changing over time of the culture that's producing it, which I find quite interesting, perhaps more so than I should at some points. And my how I arrived at that was through a confluence of being kind of a nerd and dabbling in academia for a while before getting out of there, primarily for financial reasons, because didn't want to take on debt to get a humanities degree.
Smart move.
And yeah, so then that coupled with making a few multi-state moves over the last few years, I end up here in the middle of the country, sitting on a hill talking about movies.
Yeah, and that's kind of when I came across your channel. You do kind of for people who haven't seen it yet, and I'm going to share some of your videos, especially leading up to the release. But you do kind of like a Peter Zion style thing, where you're walking through the mountains and musing and editing and all the other interesting analysis that you do.
Yeah, a little less walking through the mountains now, usually sitting, because I've discovered after being here for a few years that in the winter, the ice will sneak up on you. And in the summer, the rattlesnakes will do it. So it's just like, you know what? I'm just going to pay attention when I'm walking.
No, I get it. I live in Colorado, so just basically south of you. And you forget, I mean, how big the country is, but also like this is a desert. There's rattlesnakes and stuff around here. You got to watch out. So I guess to just start it off kind of easy, like what originally inspired your passion for history, sci-fi, both? Were they connected? Because at least for me, just for framing, like I got into sci-fi probably because of Star Wars originally, because I was a little kid. Say what you will about the prequels, but I was just the right age for it when it came out, where Jar Jar Binks was the funniest thing that I had ever seen in my life, because I was about 9 years old. Didn't age super well, but and Star Wars is really more of a fantasy than a sci-fi, really. But that kind of inspired my love early on. And I remember being a little kid and being like, Dad, what are bureaucrats? And then finding out that those are real, and just kind of going from there. So what was your history slash sci-fi origin story? What was your Star Wars?
Yeah, well, it goes back pretty far. So like in the hazy membrane of memory there, I do recall watching original series Trek, in syndication. Not quite old enough to have seen it during its original run. However, the first Star Wars I saw was Empire Strikes Back during its initial release. Dad took me to see that, and of course that made a huge impression. So it was really probably those on the sci-fi front were kind of the big pillars, as I'm sure they are for a lot of people. On the history side, it's a little more difficult to pin down. Probably reading a lot of books about the Revolutionary War era that we just had in the house, coupled with watching a lot of World War II movies, kind of led to an interest in a somewhat skewed perception on things when like you're focusing on those two historical events as a little kid.
The two big hits, basically, for American history.
And like a bunch of stuff happened in between, but whatever.
Those are the main two, right? The Civil War kind of, but those are the main two. No, it's interesting you say that, because I think for a lot of people, like at least for me, like when you're a kid, something like Star Wars or like the first generation Star Trek, it's pretty, I don't want to say childish, but it's easy to understand. It's pretty simple. But for me, I grew up in my, I guess you could say, political awakening was during, the Bush era, the global war on terror. And for me, like, I was never been, I've always had a hard time really getting into Star Trek. And granted, I've kind of been told that this is because I've only seen the original series and the Next Generation. Because to me, it always felt just a little too sterile, a little bit space HR. And I think maybe that just didn't speak to me because growing up in the era that I grew up in, and my big sci-fi thing was Stargate. And that's kind of how I found you, because the Stargate SG-1 and Atlantis were both in syndication at the time. And to me, though, that was really what spoke to me, and like, wow, it had a little bit more meat to it than just hero's journey in space. So I guess I'm curious to what your experience with that is, because you're older than me. I'm early 30s, so I was pretty young when it was happening. I didn't really, I was early teens in that era. But it's something I've talked about in other podcasts and I'm trying to write about, but then I found like your videos kind of do it better than I could, really, because I think in that era we were seeing the end of that second, I guess, first or second, depending on how you look at it, American myth making of we're going to go, I sometimes Star Trek is about neoliberalism, and that Stargate is about neoconservatism, in a certain sense, because originally, we couldn't really do, after 9/11 and the end of that era, we couldn't really just say, oh, our American exports of culture and politics, people will just naturally take that up by themselves because it's just the best damn system there is. And where, Stargate, for those who haven't seen it, it basically involves, that kind of neocon thing where it's still playing with the myth of, everybody, if they're not taking up the American way of life, well, they're just being oppressed by another system. We just need to go over there. I saw a great meme that illustrated this of like, it's not 100% accurate, obviously, but Star Trek is, we have the prime directive, we cannot interfere. Whereas, Stargate is, all your gods are fake. Here, take these guns.
Yeah. Yes, very much. I think the way I was kind of always framing it is as Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry was a World War II veteran. He was a police officer. He kind of came from that era. And so I look at Star Trek, particularly the original series and Next Gen, as being like this, they're really like World War II generation stories where, the peace is kept by the big multinational space navy, and you can almost one for one take the United Federation of Planets as the United Nations, put the two flags there and squint a little bit and they kind of blur together. Whereas Stargate went a little more in that post-war kind of disenchanted with the ideas behind some of those institutions, where it's like, yeah, we're still a big global alliance, NATO and all that, but really it's America running the show, and we're going to do what we want to do. And if we don't like you, we're either going to come over there and swat you, or we're going to get some proxies to just make trouble for you, which is kind of what the whole SG-1 series was about. It's just like, you go to this world, you find some problem, you find the people that are more aligned with what you want, and you help them. Well, okay, that's
and planets that all seem to look like upstate New York or Vancouver for some reason.
Which is another interesting little side conversation I've had about it, where periodically people will, argue with me about that. No, it's not an American show; it's a Canadian show. It was shot in Canada, but it was, MGM was making it. It's American executives. It was, it kind of on a meta level proves the point.
Or, there could be something to be said about how, and especially these days with the talks of tariffs and, Canada and America butting heads, Canada basically being a de facto American colony, or, protectorate, maybe you might say.
Yeah, more or less. It's like, if you really, strip all the fineries off the alliances and look at the actual functioning of it, it looks a lot less like a partnership of equals. It's some of the, I don't know if I want to go off on the NATO tangent, particularly right now, they're trying to make some
No.
peace deals today and stuff. So
Yeah, it's I mean, tangent away, because that's kind of always my criticism. At least, again, I've only taken in mind that I've only seen the original series and Next Generation, but it really does feel like Space NATO sometimes.
yeah,
And I've been told that later series, particularly Deep Space Nine, deal with that a little bit better.
yeah, very different.
Because I originally watched it for the first time. I'd seen like episodes here or there in syndication over the years, but I originally watched it with my wife, whose family who is big Trekkies during the 2020 pandemic, and I was like, okay, this is going to be a Wesley episode. It's not that you could probably skip that one. This one is a cultures are different episode, but there's a lot of like, again, it feels like space HR sometimes, of like, the writers taking the time to like, have some sort of social or political issue that some less advanced species is happening, and then Picard goes and lectures them for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I guess that speaks to something that you've written about a little bit, or made videos about quite a bit, actually, about how you can track American culture throughout the years through sci-fi, or specifically through Star Trek. Because again, I only saw those original two, and you kind of addressed that. In my understanding, it's like Deep Space Nine was more so in the '90s and gets a little bit more. America's starting to question its place a little bit more. So if you want to speak to that, and as a follow-up question that kind of adds to it, I don't know if you've seen the Orville, but it's like a Seth MacFarlane Star Trek parody that is basically, as far as I'm concerned, it was Seth MacFarlane's backdoor way into getting his Star Trek scripts made, which I actually really like, but I think there's something really interesting that it says about the current moment that I think speaks to our current moment in culture better than the modern Star Trek. So for the people who haven't seen your videos, if you want to expand on that a little bit and we can dig into it.
I think I'll start off with the Orville thing, because two things really struck me about that. When it first ran, it was within a couple of weeks, if I'm recalling correctly, of when Discovery launched. And so Discovery was kind of billing itself as, this is the next iteration of Star Trek. And then the Orville comes along, and we're watching it and thinking, no, this one feels more like Star Trek. It's got goofy jokes, but okay, I don't know what this other thing is. It looks vaguely Trekish, but it's something else. But also with the Orville, I think if you look at Star Trek in terms of like a modern myth, kind of building on that frontier story, and how that myth over time has kind of lost some of its pull in some ways and is taken less seriously. And we see that with Trek going from the original series and Next Gen, where it's this very earnest, straightforward, playing it totally straight kind of a thing. In Deep Space Nine, you start to see some of that. Like, yeah, it's a little gritty and ugly underneath, but we still more or less buy into it, but we just recognize that you have to do some distasteful things to make it work. And then you kind of keep going all the way till we have the Orville, and then also Lower Decks. It's kind of, that myth has reached that postmodern stage where it's making fun of itself, which in some way, I really enjoy both of those shows. In some ways, I think that's a good thing, of like not taking the mythos too seriously. But on the other, it's a little sad that something has been lost that was like a thread through those original iterations of it. And maybe it's just because I'm a grumpy old man, but there is a little bit of like, hey, you're making fun of our stories now. So
no, I get that, and that's kind of why I felt it very interesting, because I got to see, and it's on my list of things to do, to watch, especially Deep Space Nine, or I think it was Voyager, the one you made a video about. That was the 2000s one, about the transition from modern day, more or less, to the Star Trek side, in the future, which is an interesting angle to cover. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. So I saw the original, and then the 80s/90s one in the Next Generation, and then I saw the Orville, which I ended up really enjoying because this is something I wrote about. It's an article called "Spite Sincerity" and Seth MacFarlane, which basically my premise was that is say what you will about it. Yes, he's kind of making fun of it. Yes, it's being snarky in some ways. Yes, it's Seth MacFarlane, but this is something incredibly earnest from Seth MacFarlane, and I feel like this is what he always wanted to do. And I mean that for better and worse, because there are certain episodes that I thought were like genuinely really, really good sci-fi. Like there was one, if you remember, of like they were all on, there's this colonist who were all on a ship and they didn't understand that they were on like a gestation period ship that was kind of lost at Bay, or they had one where they went through 2D space. There are some that were, I don't know, kind of like very preachy in ways that were very uninteresting, like the social media planet, or the one where
although I thought that one did have something like really worthwhile at the core of it.
There was a kernel of it, but I feel like they just didn't really dig into it. And that's kind of like, I can't, especially if you watch a lot of syndicated sci-fi, there's a lot of like, okay, this is a cool idea, but they only had 2 weeks to work on it, really. And the other one I remember thinking it was like, the planet that had a rigid caste system based on astrology signs. Like to me, it would have been more interesting if like, a certain time of year, like, oh yeah, there's a reason this astrology sign is oppressed. There's a historical reason behind it, but they're trying to move past it as a society. But stuff like that. That's classic sci-fi. But I remember like, maybe it's just a function of it getting canceled and it'll come back and it'll be better. But it kind of, I feel like at least with the Orville, at least for me, the middle of the series is really where they hit their stride of not being too jokey, but not taking themselves too seriously, which is something about the writing. And I feel like that it speaks to our current moment in culture and that post-war consensus that, for those who haven't seen it, it's basically Star Trek. But there's always peace. But the only two alien races that don't want to join are basically, the ones who are capitalist and religious, and the ones who don't respect trans pronouns, which, it's to me, it says something about like that mindset that like, that those could be the only, sticking points. There couldn't be serious, economic or cultural reasons why somebody would not want to be a part of the Federation/UN. It's just, they're bigots straight on its face,
Yeah, it's one of the ways I think that the Orville really, I mean, on one hand, it's missing potential, but I mean, it's first and foremost at its inception a comedy show, but it's a smoother transition than you get with like Alex Kurtzman's New Trek, because like with the Orville, you have a lot of old Trek people that are working on the show, so you have this carryover of people that know the lore, people that were involved with it, who have some attachment to it, and they're kind of evolving it with the times rather than with some of the newer canon Trek shows. It feels like, the theater kids came in and they want to impose their idea on you, so they're going to like tell it through the story. And at least with the Orville, even when it's stumbling, it always felt like it was an organic sort of stumble, that it was coming from somewhere.
Yeah, it comes by it honestly, for sure.
Yeah, it respected the material it was working with rather than trying to subvert it.
Or just using it kind of as a skin suit, because the little bit I've seen or heard discussion about, like I know, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I've seen basically like, and again, I feel like this is something that again speaks to the moment where it's either like that very theater kid side of it, or like I've seen, for example, I saw the first, maybe second Star Trek Alex Kurtzman movie. I remember thinking, yeah, this was fun, but it didn't really feel like Star Trek in any meaningful way. It felt like more like Star Wars, which, for a 2-hour popcorn flick is fine. But like, for example, the Picard show, it's still the same characters doing the exact same thing. I don't know what the timeline is like, but in real life, 30 or 40 years later, and it's kind of unsatisfying in the way that, the Star Wars sequels were unsatisfying for me. It's like, oh, 40 years later, you did all that work. The Empire's still doing its thing. You kind of, it's, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Because to me, like I remember seeing like, I could be wrong on this, but more or less like directly Captain Picard went to the past to fight ice, or you're seeing, either that or
the
the
second
Star
season was awful.
Yeah, or like with the Star Trek sequel or Star Wars sequels, excuse me. It's the same thing, because we have to keep defeating fascism over and over again. Even though we've won, we don't really feel like as a culture maybe we have a new myth to go forward into the future with. So we have to keep resurrecting fascism or racism, what have you, to do this fight over and over again, and it feels unsatisfying.
Well, okay. Hopefully, I'll remember my train of thought here to come back to the fascism thing, because I kind of want to start with on the Trek front, where there were a lot of things I liked about that first season of Discovery. It caught a lot of flack, but it had a lot of potential. There were some very interesting threads to it. They just didn't pay them off very well. Probably most notably with the Captain Lorca character, who was initially set up as this basically Starfleet captain that went through a war and he's suffering from PTSD now, which I thought was a very interesting thing that they could have done with, because we haven't really seen that too much in Star Trek, with really the exception of Nog in Deep Space Nine. But of course they copped out and it's like, oh no, he's from the evil mirror universe, that's why he does bad things. It's like, you fuck off, show. But then kind of coming through to the Disney era Star Wars sequels and kind of their treatment of it, where Force Awakens is really just remaking Star Wars essentially. And that one, I thought they missed a lot of opportunities there, largely because, well, I mean, it's J.J. Abrams. He does the spectacle thing and doesn't really think it through. But I thought they could have done something really interesting with the First Order as sort of this, little remnant rump state off on the edge of the galaxy there, where it's like some Imperial officers got together and just sort of like what some of the Nazi leaders had in mind toward the end of World War II. Like Himmler and some of his SS henchmen were like, well, if they move into Germany too far, then we can just set up a new capital in Prague and we can continue fighting the war from there. It's like something like that I thought would have been an interesting take on it, but they didn't go that route. But they still kind of cling to that fascist imagery, that using that shorthand for the bad guys, which, I mean, there's a lot of facets to that. And part of it is just that the Second World War is the origin story for the modern world. And it's kind of like we haven't quite gotten over it yet. It's kind of changed form. Like we can see during the war and in the immediate aftermath of it, when Nazis and fascists are depicted in entertainment, it's more or less usually in historical drama kind of stuff, or it's just like very near term sort of like, they're Germans, they're Italians, they started to blur together with the Soviets, which some people get very upset about when I say that, well, yeah, that's a totally natural blending. But I mean, peel away the symbols and look at the actions and there's a lot of overlap. But then you get into the 60s and 70s when you had people that were either very young when those things were happening, or like they were old enough to be involved in the war, like Roddenberry, or more often the case when you get into the 70s, like the people that were writing, Battlestar Galactica and series like this, who were too young to have been directly involved in it, but they were kind of raised with those memories of it. And that's when you get this stylized sort of Star Wars Imperial kind of, I mean, obviously there's a heavy Nazi influence here, but they're not actually this. They're just like, we want you to know they're bad guys, so we're going to give them the flared pants and the tall boots, and we're going to make them walk around in these stiff uniforms. Okay, fine, we get it. But now it's become this, in the entertainment sphere, it's this almost cartoonish kind of a thing where it's like you can't take it seriously. I mean, the Star Wars sequels are a great example of that, where you've got Hux up there screaming on the podium. It's just like, come on, man. It's like, I'm not buying this. But at the same time, we have this weird cultural fixation where we've almost overplayed the fascist hand. where it's like it becomes so much of a shorthand for the bad guys that we don't recognize the bad guys unless they're wearing armbands and goose stepping around. It's like that. What started out as sort of a cultural inoculation has reached this point where it is actually making it easier for other iterations of any kind of authoritarian sort of a, technocratic, centralizing, top-down sort of ideologies to take hold, because you can say, well, it's because it's against the fascists. So, well, I don't know. You get a bunch of people that are telling me what to do and threatening me with prisoner death if I don't do it. Then, I mean, it's a pretty academic distinction whether they're fascists or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of there's a lot to jump in there, but just right off the top of my head, the first thing, like I don't know really where I describe myself politically these days. The very cliche thing is politically homeless, but I did come more from the left background, and I think a lot of that stuff is still and I don't necessarily ascribe to all of it anymore, or a lot of it, but I do think something like historical materialism is an important way, not the only way to look at history, but it's an important way. And if you look at, say, either, and this is something that I don't want to say exactly butt heads, because I make a point of not arguing with people online anymore. But what I read is like, and I'll write something like that, for example, fascism or communism as we knew it were very specific things in time, in history, in culture, that it's basically impossible to recreate in the modern world, at least in my opinion. You can still have other forms of authoritarianism, but I don't think there's any danger of, seeing fascism earnestly returning in any other way as farce. But we are in this, as you mentioned, this place in history where, because it's so, and to a lesser degree, communism, it's so strongly ingrained for for the last 80 years, 3 or 4 generations, depending on how you want to look at it. And that's something that you've made videos that I found really interesting about the way that fascism has been treated in media, particularly in sci-fi, directly following World War II, to the generation right after. I think, you talked about the movie Wizards, for example, that directly, literally lifted Nazi imagery and animated over it. And you see, Star Wars, obviously, where it's pretty directly there, but not exactly one for one to, say, Firefly, for example, where they kind of have space Nazis, but it's used as interchangeable bad guy, to now, like you mentioned, where it's so divorced from the original context that it's both I think you hit the nail on it really well with the First Order, how it ended up being. It's both irredeemably evil just because it's evil, but also comical and you can't take seriously. So it feels like we're kind of reaching the end of the tread for this myth, because it's paradoxically, I didn't really like the Star Wars sequels, but Kylo Ren is the best character by far because he's interesting and had stuff going on. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on it? Because you've made a lot of great content about the myth making of fascism as our eternal enemy, which is something that pisses off my lefty friends. The United States, say what you will, there racist aspects or whatever, we're not fascist. The United States is a fundamentally anti-fascist state. We fought a war against it, but we're trying to reconfigure that myth.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, kind of coming back to that idea of the Second World War being the modern creation myth. It's like all the major global institutions kind of came out of the aftermath of that, and the established order. You've got the Soviet bloc over here with their sphere of influence, and you have the Western bloc, which is really America and some vassal states, which, I mean, I'm sorry to anybody in Western Europe watching this, but I'm not trying to be a dick here. But that's kind of been the arrangement. But now we're finally starting to see, not only in culture with the fascism myth turning into this kind of joke almost, but also some of those institutions and some of those arrangements starting to break down. And it's almost like in a like in a cultural sense, we're starting to finally get to the end of the Second World War, where it's like that echo is finally starting to fade. And it's going to be interesting to see both how that changes in the popular culture, but also what the like the macro level geopolitical consequences of that are, because we're already starting to see kind of, I mean, America starting to withdraw a little bit from some of its alliances. Europe is starting to look to its own defense a little bit more, and everybody's rearming now, and new expanded military budgets are coming. And going back to the 90s when the whole Soviet bloc thing just kind of imploded, and then it was, you had NATO there that was structured specifically to contain them, like, oh, whoa, I guess we won. What do we do? Well, one way would have been to say, yay, declare victory, kind of wind things down over a few years and use the much hyped up peace dividend. But instead it was, well, let's expand the alliance, because these countries might want to be part of this big protective umbrella against something. Not sure, but we'll find something. And so it's just kind of this zombified post-war world order, just kind of lumbering along, trying to find its way, even though it's kind of served its purpose. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting, I don't know, quarter century ahead to see how all of that shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of a couple things. I've heard it just, I've heard it said that, like, the post World War II order was basically created to fight and win the Cold War, and without the Cold War, we're a hammer without a nail. And that's when you see like the neocons going from, like, hawkishly anti-communist to the new enemy was, global Islamic terror. And then you see within the the imperial core, it was the domestic Islamic terror. Now it's domestic white supremacist terror. And it's so much a hammer without a nail that be it when I was growing up, I would read about, like, FBI agents who would groom some poor 17-year-old Muslim kid into talking about doing a terrorist attack, or the white supremacist supposed it was a couple years ago, they were trying to, like, kidnap the governor of Michigan. And like 4 out of 6 of the conspirators were feds.
It's like a bunch of feds out there trying to goad each other into doing stuff. It's
you want,
FBI
like,
foils FBI terror plot.
Yeah, if they just accidentally all end up being all feds one time. But but to speak to that kind of loops back around really well to Stargate and the time that it was made in. Like, I guess Stargate SG-1, because the original movie was more sci-fantasy, in my opinion. It's kind of corny and fun, but that's when because that's the myth that I grew up with, was like, okay, we did World War II we were unequivocally good, our enemies were unequivocally evil, and we just need to get rid of their evil leaders. And if they were ever to, and then they will realize, oh, of course, the greatest is liberators, and we all know how that went. But I think, like, I don't know if you followed this, there's talk about bringing Stargate back on Amazon, which if you've seen any of their shows, like, the Wheel of Time show, I don't know if you're a fantasy guy too much.
I watched the first.
I think Brandon Sanderson himself said, there are adaptations that are one for one, and they're reimaginings, and that's somewhere in the middle. And I think he was being diplomatic. But in any case, like, if they bring it back, I imagine they're just going to do. I think they said it's going to be a reboot, but it's going to be for that mythical modern audience. But I think if it were me, for some reason they put some random guy who has a blog and a podcast in charge of it, something that would be interesting if they were to do a reboot is, okay, we went to go liberate the Jaffa from the Goa'uld, and maybe some of them want to, but some of them are also like, they may not be perfect for us, but we actually, all things considered, have a lot more in common culturally with the Goa'uld. We'd like to maybe renegotiate with the Goa'uld. But we don't really want you to come over here and knock out our whole government. But something like that would be interesting to me, just because, it's a new way of tackling that myth, but they can't do it. So they'll just do the same thing, but more diverse.
Yeah, a continuation from SG1, kind of with that real-time gap, like we were describing. That would be really interesting. But yeah, I can't see anybody actually doing it. What I'd be really interested in seeing is a Stargate, either continuation or reboot, made like 10 or 15 years from now, when some of this cultural stuff is finished shaking out, because I think we kind of peaked between 2020 and 2023 with some of the really out there stuff, and it's kind of been on a downslope since. And it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like anything made during that period, it's like, okay, this is not good.
Mm-hmm.
This is preaching to me with stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or directing at audiences that I don't think exist. Um, I'll just wait. But yeah, I think we're going to see some of it's going to be backlash to older ideas and try to resurrect old mythologies and things. But I suspect something new is going to kind of shake out of this in the next decade or so, which I think is, I'm kind of looking forward to see what happens.
Me too. And I guess that's touches on another thing I wanted to talk to you about, because a lot of your work is about sci-fi as the shorthand for cultural myth making. And we've been talking about like the World War II, the post-World War II mythology, quite a bit right now. And I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on what it could potentially be, because I think you had one or two videos. I won't spoil it, because I imagine you'll talk about it, what that could be. But I remember because you mentioned in one of your videos, podcaster and historian Daryl Cooper, and he got in some pretty hot water recently for World War II historical revisionism, but not like, the Holocaust didn't happen, but more so, all right, this is more complicated of a conflict than than it's given credit for. And you saw such a strong immune reaction to something that's, like Churchill is not a completely angelic figure, or FDR. And I guess like first of all, like as far as like the World War II re-examination, I don't know if maybe that can be a part of the new myth or part of processing this, because it's gotten to the point, like you said, with fascism or the World War II myth, the myth itself has overtaken the reality of it. And like on one level, like, because if you're a fan of history and a historian, I'm sure you've inevitably encountered, somebody who's a Holocaust denier, like, no, you couldn't, gas and cremate 6 million people in 2 years. And like, okay, well, if that were what any historian said, that would be a problem. But,
Yeah.
the majority died in the Eastern Front, and basically is what Daryl Cooper said. But, then at the same time, you'll talk to people who basically think like Captain America and Schindler's List are documentaries, So what do you see, I guess, as, this is a two-part question. We have more time to discuss it. But like, what is a healthy way of reevaluating the World War II mythos? Because you don't want to go too far in the other direction where like actually the Austrian painter was a good guy, but at the same time, like you have to have a new critical eye, especially when we're dealing with countries who have a different perspective on the whole World War II situation, who are now more as equals now, say China or a reconstituted Russia.
Yeah, it's really that I think a big factor is that the up until really even today, but it's starting to fade, the historical study of the Second World War has been so tied in with the world power structures that you had the whole Cold War structure, the United States versus the Soviet bloc, and that's it. And we need to maintain all of this, but also that it's still in living memory. And so, like for most of my life, I mean, I talk to people that fought in that war, so it's like that kind of cements a certain viewpoint into the popular culture there. But now that we're getting far enough from it that there aren't very many people that were actually involved left, and that Cold War power structure has kind of fallen apart, not completely, but in large part, we're finally getting to the point where we can take a little bit more objective look at it. And yeah, I think Daryl Cooper is one of he's kind of on not the absolute bleeding edge of it. That was probably, I'm going to catch some flack for this, but I would say it was probably David Irving, even though he kind of slipped off into being a little bit too German apologist after he wrote a few books. But when he was writing, it was too early. The war had still been too recent to really be able to start to dig into that and question some of those core assumptions, which I think is why he kind of went off the rails with it, because the backlash was just so harsh that it's like when everybody attacks you, the natural response is to attack back. And that's kind of the issue. So we're not quite there yet where we can really start objectively taking this thing apart and really looking at what the underlying causes were and what the motivating issues and all the various belligerent powers and the people involved were. And I think it's going to end up looking a lot more gray when more academics feel comfortable saying some unorthodox things. And I'm certainly, don't want to be misinterpreted as like, oh, it's going to be safe to deny the Holocaust soon. It's like, well, no, because that's one of those things. It's like the moon landing. It's like, well, could you fake it? Yeah, maybe, but it would be harder than actually doing it. So, I mean, like, come on, how do you?
Yeah, it's more
how do you actually make all these
context.
people disappear if you don't actually, So
yeah, right.
Come on, like,
well, to me, like
that's not where we want to go.
Yeah, to me, the interesting thing is, and again, because this is more me coming from the left, like when I was in more leftist spaces, it was uncontroversial to say Churchill is a monster for, for example, his treatment of Indians when he was under a colonial governor, which, I don't want to draw a one-to-one comparison, but there's a dehumanization there that in both cases that allows for people dying and them not being seen as fully human, and like another interesting context that it's things like that are, if you take an individual fact, it's fairly uncontroversial, but if you do anything that will seriously shake the narrative, that's when it becomes problematic. Because it's something you mentioned in one of your videos. I know that it's a largely uncontroversial fact to know that the United States, leading up to World War I, directly funded and armed the Soviet Union. But it's another one of those things that it's taken as common history, like, oh yeah, the Germans rose again after World War II and rearmed, and you're like, okay, well, how did they do that? Where did they get the funding for it? And it was a lot of the same funding. And you could do conspiracy theories on either end, where the more lefty people will say that that capital basically just has no moral, and it will go wherever there is fuel to be burned, so to speak. I think there's something to that. There's some more right-wing conspiracies, far right, that I don't really want to dignify. But there's something to me that if you look at the larger context of the conflict of World War I, World War II, both Japan and Germany being rising powers, Russia being a rising power, it was, again, not conspiracy theory, but stated policy of the Anglo-American establishment. They did not want Russia and Germany to ever ally, because that would be kind of game over for their monopoly on Europe. And something like that is a much more complicated and nuanced point to make than, very bog standard, low IQ, actually the Germans are the good guy type of thing,
Yeah. One other element that, talk about this in the video coming up this week a little bit, but it's that there's a tendency to, less so in academia, although it's still an issue, but in the popular discussion of these issues, to take these various countries and socio-political systems and treat them in isolation. They'll look at the industrialization in the Soviet Union, and well, that is what Lenin and Stalin did. This is their accomplishment. Or you look at Nazi Germany, and it's like, well, they did all this bad stuff, invading their neighbors, or they built new roads and they fixed the economy. I've heard both arguments, both of which have a lot of nuanced layers to it. But like in the broadest, most chunky sense, like, yes. But none of it happened in isolation, because we have to kind of think about it in terms of both of those systems were existing within what was essentially like a capitalist global order that was primarily run by the British Empire and, to a lesser extent, the United States at that time. It was this largely Anglosphere, but more broadly Western liberal capitalist sort of system. And the Soviet Union, for example, functioned within that. They tried to isolate themselves to some extent, but they were still buying expertise, buying machine tools, buying materials, trading raw materials. They were not a closed sort of a system. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to look at Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or Maoist China or any of these as these enclosed little experiments, either for yay socialism, look what they accomplished, or socialism is garbage because look how bad it went, because it was a facet of this much larger global system that is a lot more complicated to try and map out and trace cause and effect with it, because it is so large and so interconnected. That would be life's work, I think, even coming up with sort of a rough model of how that period played out from that kind of a scale.
Yeah, we're still close to it, and like you said, it's so ingrained in our culture and myth making, and it's one of those things that, again, that like it's so interesting, but I don't want to put this, because as you've spoken about, more for the audience maybe who hasn't heard about it, like, it's the United States and the Soviet Union were not really at odds, basically up until near the end of World War II. Like there's a lot of different reasons, but to me, one of the main sticking points for my limited understanding, I'll do that old Dan Carlin thing. I'm not a historian, I'm just a fan of history, but the Soviets refused the Marshall Plan, whereas Western Europe did not. And that's when, Joseph Stalin stopped being Uncle Joe, and that's when he started becoming Hitler 2.0. Yeah. And then ever since then, there's been just been a rash of Hitlers. You hate to see it. Saddam Hussein was Hitler, Gaddafi Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. So that's when it becomes. Also, I feel like be it now, Saddam Hussein, whoever, or Putin now. Like, I feel like it's harder and harder to keep this myth up when, even in living memory for somebody like me, it's like I remember when Putin was on stage with George W. Bush or Obama, like he was a good guy pretty recently. It's hard to like, and then you're like, oh, he kind of is like Hitler in that sense that like, these people were our allies and then they stopped being useful. Cause what's that old Henry Kissinger quote? Like it's dangerous to be United States' ally, but it's deadly to be, dangerous to be an enemy, but deadly to be an ally. Sorry, you fuzzed out for a second.
To think like, okay, if I were running a little country, how would I handle this? It would be like, well, I would try to avoid any entanglements with America. That's for damn sure. It's like I'm not going to antagonize them, but no, I don't want to be part of a defense pact. It's like, no, we're good. We're fine over here. Just some Russian jets. It's like, oh, you don't like that? Well, okay, we'll probably do it anyway, but we don't want the F-35. Mm-hmm. And all the things that come with it.
So I guess, so I guess that loops in well to the second part of the question, like, maybe the last little chunk, second to last I want to get with you. And I feel like we've talked a lot about both in the context of sci-fi and, academic history, whatever you want to call it. Or even just like, me being a fan of history and somebody who reads random history books, we're seeing the end. I think like, to me, like between 9/11 and Ukraine, that was the 1-2 punch of, again, like if we want to loop back to like, the Star Trek of like, everybody will just want to be an American basically because it's just so darn great. Even if like the American culture that we want to export is totally 100% incompatible with their culture, and that doesn't even speak poorly to their culture. And the Ukraine thing that, like, we're liberators and we're objectively doing good things because say what you will about Putin, and Russia, and I in no way, shape, or form endorse the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
But there's this myth that, like, oh, he's a tin pot dictator, and if we could just topple him, it's like, no, the internet exists. We can see what they say. They like and support him. So, we can't pretend that, like, we're just one regime change away from Russia being America. We tried that in the 90s and it didn't work. So all that to say, between that or say the new Star Wars, Star Trek, potential reboot of Stargate, the myth is kind of died. But if you're, as you obviously know, the myth of America has changed and, to use the media term, like, been rebooted many a time in United States history. What do you see that being, either in the sci-fi or like storytelling, myth making in general, or like a revitalization of American spirit? Because just for a little bit more context, and I'll throw it back to you. Like, for a long time, I was considered myself more a lefty, but that was more so just because, like, I grew up in the global war on terrorism era. I was like, these wars are bad. We should take care of American workers, stuff like that. And that was very left coded at the time, and it's kind of switched to being more right coded. So I don't really have I don't really, I care about a label as much as I have specific things that I want to see happen. But, the other thing that I've kind of changed on that's been, more conservative, right coded, whatever you want to say, is, for all its flaws, I still like America. This is my home. This is from my, my culture. This is where my family is, going back generations. Yes, we've done bad things in the past, but show me a country that hasn't. I don't want to see us, just fade away like the Ottoman Empire or something like that. I want to see a revitalization, and I've been struggling with what could that be? What could our new American identity be? Because we can't go back to what we were. So there needs to be some way forward. So in either of those, ideally both fronts, what do you see if anything, can we have a way forward?
Well, I mean, the short answer, of course, is I don't know, but kind of looking at what's going on now in kind of a broader historical context, there are some interesting parallels. Like, I always find it interesting when people talk about Trump as this, like, crazy, out there, nutty president that just came out of nowhere and is a break from American norms, because I kind of see him in the mold of, like, we have this tradition of wealthy aristocrats kind of functioning as populist figures. Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson. It's a recurring theme throughout American history. And if I look at it kind of from the standpoint of, well, it's that broad concept kind of playing out again. Well, what does that look like? Well, those guys did some pretty significant changes in a structural reorganization way, but they weren't the figures that led directly to a national or a cultural kind of revitalization. They just kind of shook things up enough, broke the status quo to shake the table up enough for something new to form on it. And I think that might be where we are now, which is, like, I talk to a lot of people that work in various fields that are being adversely affected by this whole Doge thing, because it's causing vast amounts of confusion and just throwing everything into disarray. And I kind of look at it in that kind of a context where it's like, okay, I recognize that this is, for a lot of people, a problem, and they're not going about this in the most judicious, well thought out way. It really would be better if this was done surgically, but instead, like, they're running around with sledgehammers, just smashing things and seeing where the pieces fall.
Or a chainsaw, as it were.
Yeah. But at the same time, something has to be done, because it's completely unsustainable. The level of bureaucracy and spending that has been built up over really since that World War II period, just decade after decade, piling more and more stuff on with relatively little pushback compared to earlier points in American history. So maybe it really is that same kind of a thing where, you know, you could compare it very broadly to Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting, or, you know, Jackson coming in there and messing around with the banking system. And it's just something that kicks the established system just hard enough that the whole thing wobbles and has to kind of reform in some new, more stable structure that better serves the general population. Hopefully, the other alternative is that it just gets worse, but in a less predictable way, which always a risk. But on a more cultural sort of level, that one's, I mean, I guess I'm going to be totally just spitballing here because I have no real framework to kind of hold this into, but I do get a sense that, how do I want to say this? Since about 2015 or so, well, maybe even earlier, maybe it was like late aughts, I had noticed the political divide like becoming more and more not only abrasive, but fairly evenly split. Like it was about half was one way, half was the other, and they didn't want to talk to each other. And it just kind of kept getting worse. And then, you know, through the Trump years, it got insane. And then COVID was absolute madness. But I'm starting to notice now, like I used to have conversations with people, particularly online, where I would say something that, you know, it would just be questioning something and it would get this barrage of like, no, you fascist. What? But now there's this trickle more of people with vastly different ideological assumptions being more willing to actually have a conversation about it. We usually don't resolve anything. And there are still the, you know, absolute nutters that just like are looking for something to argue about and just jump on it. I don't think that's going to be saved, but it seems like it's that percentage has been slowly shrinking over the last few years, which I think is a good sign. We might be getting a little bit closer to being able to just sit down and have a conversation again without having to pre-select for people we agree with first.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we're starting to see that more and more. I primarily do stuff on Substack, and I'll, you know, post the podcast goes, you know, all your major wherever your podcasts are sold. But it does seem to be like there is a hunger for something like that, that it's a little bit more nuanced. Because I don't know, like at least for me right now, like you know, they call it the heterodox moment sometimes, where it feels, if nothing else, like partisan hackery is just very, you know, kind of hacky. Like there's not much more to,
now.
Yeah, like you know exactly what you're going to get, and we know the results of these ideologies. You know, it's going to be what it says on the tin. So hopefully we'll see more of that. And I feel like we're seeing, you know, for better or worse, you know, somebody like, you know, JD Vance is, you know, Donald Trump's vice president, but he also co-sponsored bills with like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So I don't know. For me, like on the cultural side, political side, maybe it'll be something that's more of a synthesis like that. Because you mentioned, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, or, you know, FDR is the big one, that there needs to be some big shakeup. And just to, like, you know, get, you know, I've heard, again, Dan Carlin called it a historical arsonist, somebody who's like, all right, there's just too much mess. They cut the Gordian knot. Let's start again. And I think America has, despite all the problems, I think we still have a lot going for us. Economically, culturally, there's some problems, but I think we still have the chance to start again. And I think, you know, kind of build on that a little bit. I wonder what your thoughts on it, like, a neo frontier myth or something like that, because it feels like that has been, for better or for worse, for the entirety of our country, either having a frontier, creating a new frontier, in fiction, like, space in Star Trek, or reconquering the frontier. There's obviously been bad sides of that. There's been good sides of that, but I also feel like it's something that is still, I think, unique to the American spirit that exists. Because I've been reading a lot about the era right after, kind of leading up to World War I. We were really starting to deal with the lack of, the frontier was gone. We don't want to be an imperialist power, even though we kind of became one, and those growing pains, and like, Roosevelt, McKinley. And I feel like, because everybody's like, the hack thing is, oh, this is like 1930s Germany. No, it kind of feels more similar to that era, which the good side is, it was a period of national revitalization. The bad side is World War I happened right after that. So I don't know, kind of rambling way of adding to the question, but I feel like we still have something in us, and as a country, as the world, that we can pull out of this and do something new.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that definitely the frontier mythos and that drive is extremely pronounced in America. But I think on a more general level, it's really kind of a human thing. I mean, we are a species that colonize the entire planet, essentially. It's like people are not indigenous to Northern Europe or the Americas. We walked here and made it work. So it's like there's always been this, in pretty much, I mean, you can always find exceptions to this, like the Sand people in Southern Africa, for example, or seem to be a very content little non-hierarchical society. But most human societies have always had that, at least within a minority of the population, that drive to say, you know what, I think I can do better over there, past those hills, over those mountains, over that ocean. And then a small percentage of them are like, you know what, I'm actually going to do it. To hell with this, I'm out. Let's see how it goes. And I think on some level we need that. We've been lacking it really since the 19th century, when you really get down to it. And I don't want to go so far as to say that it's been a causal thing for a lot of major conflicts. Like, I mean, you might be able to draw a thread through from the loss of frontiers to the world wars, for example, fighting over the same colonies and shifting borders. And I'm not going to die on that hill, but I do think that we, as a species, don't do well in captivity. And if we don't have either a physical frontier or something that will culturally and psychologically serve that role, we're going to run into problems. And we might end up like those experiments where they just keep adding more and more rats to a cage until they all go psycho and start tearing each other apart. It's like, we need something. And the options we have available right now are kind of limited. It's there's a few places on Earth that could still be developed, made habitable to some extent. You could let people live in Antarctica. You could let people try to, slowly irrigate the Sahara or something. I don't think it'll work real well. But also the problem is that, well, it's like Robert Zubrin said in his book Case for Mars, that or maybe it wasn't the book, maybe it was just talking to him once, but he said that those places kind of don't work to fill that role because the cops are too close. It's like if you go and you try to set up a country in Antarctica, even if they'll let you do it, you're going to have all this international oversight kind of watching you and make sure that you follow the accepted, neoliberal norms and structures, and whereas, what are our other options really? Well, it's like the moon's kind of crap for a number of reasons, and Mars is like, yeah, I don't know, maybe. It's like if Elon Musk wants to put up his own money to go for this, then like absolutely 100%. Good luck. I want to see this work.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be as happy as anybody if he manages to pull this off and get some permanent presence there. But there are definitely some valid objections to why that's not going to be able to serve that role, at least not at the mass level of like the discovery of the New World did, for example. It's going to be much, much harder to pull things off. I do kind of wonder sometimes if maybe like some sort of space habitats in the asteroid belt might actually be the first step to that, because then you'll be able to have a resource base, like an economic base that you can actually build something on. You get some people out there, you start mining and exporting platinum group metals and whatnot. And also, you can find all kinds of ice and various other things that you can use in space. And that's, I think, the best way that you can start out having some sort of a viable space-based economy that can support some kind of a population without having to constantly be shipped stuff from Earth. It would be a very small population, and it's got its own set of problems. But yeah, it's like, I'm not quite sure what it looks like, but I think we're going to have to figure it out, even if it's in a blundering, clumsy sort of way where we make a bunch of mistakes on the way, because I don't think that being trapped on one planet indefinitely without any new places to kind of go and explore and try new social experiments and try to build new societies is really going to work long term.
Yeah, and I guess that's I feel like that's an interesting question, both technically and philosophically, because you've touched on this in one of your videos where it was talking about Star Trek, and I'm not enough of a Trekkie to remember the exact terms, but the way that the Klingons see society is either you're a stagnating society or you're like an imperial society that's moving out into the stars. Because I wonder, again, like on a purely like material, I would say I think like, back in like I would read things like the 60s and 70s that overpopulation was going to be a problem. Now we're reaching population collapse. I think we have enough resources on the earth that we could probably figure it out for the most part, but there's a limit to growth. We have to have some sort of equilibrium, and to a certain degree it might be superfluous to go out into space, at least with our technology that we have right now, because sometimes I'll read your pop scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, aliens would never come here and it's pointless to ever, try to do spacefaring past just, the moon because it's neat. But to me, that's like, if, in 1899, somebody's, why bother trying to make a plane? It's not possible to fly, right? Our technology could advance in ways that, we can't conceptualize right now because we haven't gotten there. But I think it says something about the human spirit and exploration in and of itself. Because if you look at the early explorers out to the New World, and obviously acknowledging like there were downstream bad effects for people in the the natives in the New World. That having been said, the early people were doing it just for the sake of adventure, basically, and then it became a business, and then colonies. And I wonder if we're just not in the stage of culture that we maybe, not directly Trump, but like this energy that he seems to be able to even, just beginning to harness, that we're in a phase that will change civilization to the point where we will go explore, for its own sake. Because it's something I remember reading, or I guess listening to what you said about the talk of Mars colonization, and you kind of bemoaning, and maybe not bemoaning, I don't say that punitively, but because at least for me, as a I'm a the accursed millennial, to me, like my thought is like colonizing Mars who fucking cares? Like there's problems on Earth, you know. Let's colonize the Sahara Desert if you're going to do terraforming, right? And I feel like just because of the era that I grew up in, I can't conceptualize the mindset of exploration for its own sake, yes, but like from my understanding, so much of the space race in the 60s was I want to beat the Ruskies. Like, I don't fucking care about beating the Ruskies, quite frankly. Well, let's get things under control on Earth and then we'll talk. So all that to say, like, I feel like that's maybe where sci-fi again has value, because this was, I grew up in the, as I said, my entry point was like the Star Wars prequels and Stargate, where it was that very specific time in history and culture. And now we're kind of on that downturn. But I would read about people who watched the original Star Trek when it came out. In and of itself, it was so like awe-inspiring, because this was right after World War II, and wanting to explore for its own sake felt like a moral good for its own sake. And I'm hoping we can get to that point again culturally without a world war, but it feels like we're probably going to have to go through some hard times one way or another to get to that point. Yeah.
It just kind of got me thinking that trying to hold on to my train of thought here, that kind of the thing with a lot of the older science fiction, the mid 20th century stuff, is that it had that frontier idea, but the specific motivations, like you were saying, don't really resonate anymore. Like going to Mars because like it's a big red desert, it's cool, and people want to live there, right? Or exploring for its own sake, it doesn't really resonate that much, as much as it used to anyway. But I think that the problem isn't so much the idea of, okay, we have to expand out. It's rather, okay, why do we want to do it? What is the underlying motive to the action? And I think it kind of comes back to like what you were saying of, well, there's problems we can take care of on Earth instead of doing this big, grandiose, expensive thing. And I can remember having iterations of that conversation for going back decades. And it's like, well, we don't want to do this because we should solve problems here first. And then it's like, okay, well, when are we ready? When is it good enough? Like, when do we reach that stage where we fixed everything and now we can go do some crazy thing? And that, I think, is why, like, the whole solar punk idea doesn't really resonate that strongly, is because you have this idea of, well, we'll achieve this sustainable equilibrium and everything will be great and we'll be living in harmony with nature, but we'll still maintain some of the modern conveniences and it's just perfect. It's like, oh, well, then that's time. That's when we do something else, right?
Oh, once everything is perfect, right?
We just sit in our stagnant paradise. Okay, well, that's kind of shit. I don't know if I'm inspired by that. And I don't know how much of it is just how much of it is like American cultural stuff, how much of it is generational, but that like being willing to endure some hardship just to not be bored and to go do something cool. Like I always think of the it's apocryphal. I haven't been able to actually document that this ad actually ran at the time, but with the Shackleton expedition to Antarctica, when they like sailed down there in some ships and they were going to try to get down to the South Pole. Well, the ships got stuck in ice and the crew had to get off the thing, and a bunch of them died, and some of them got on a boat and they rowed to some like whaling post on an island 200 miles away or something crazy. So they were able to like rescue the few guys that survived on the continent there. But supposedly, and again, I'm 90% sure this was apocryphal because I haven't been able to actually verify the authenticity of it. But the story is that Shackleton put an ad in the paper asking, it was low pay, bad food, harsh conditions, almost certain death. And had like 10 times more people than the expedition could have possibly used applying for this thing, just because it was like, hey, yeah, this is doing something different. This isn't just like sitting around being comfortable, doing what's expected, being a cog in the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is probably part of what any new mythology has to really grab onto. I'm not quite sure how it does it or exactly how that translates into action. Those are like the big steps that I don't think anybody's figured out yet. But yeah, there's something back to that idea of there's always this small percentage of the population that just like starts crawling out of their skin when everything is nice and normal and safe and predictable, and they want to just like run out and do something out in the wilderness, find something new, and they end up building new branches of civilization when they're allowed to do it. And not all of them succeed, but those that do drag everybody else forward.
Yeah, well, I guess I definitely know what you mean, because it's interesting how that's something like when you talk about like the expedition to Antarctica like that, or in the abstract of like, the be it Stargate, Star Trek, the early stuff, the adventurism, that's super appealing to me, because as opposed to like the abstract of Elon Musk colonizes Mars, like, yep, and I'm sure it'll be really cool for you, buddy. Send me some pictures. I don't care. I think you have to have something that has people buying into it in some way. Because again, if we're looking at the original, colonization of the New World, there was some people would buy into it just because of the reason you said. And I think maybe if there's any way forward, it'll be something along those lines. Because obviously, like it's self-evidently true, and it's been discussed to death. Like the knock-on bad effects, like it'd be awesome if you were Cortez and his conquistadors. Not so much if you're an Aztec. But if we were to expand the franchise, so to speak, of we're all explorers now. It's not something that's limited to something ethnic or something like that. But it has to be something more than just for all of humanity, and something you don't want that to the negative aspects of colonialism, because to me, like that's what I see. Like what doesn't excite me is somebody like Elon Musk talking about, oh, humanity is going to go to Mars. It's like, okay, well, I still have to work my shitty job tomorrow. Have fun with that, but having some kind of way to find buy-in, and I feel like that's where sci-fi is most valuable in like that, in that myth-making way, because there's been so many scientific innovations that were driven by something that like some prop maker in 1963 made, just be because, oh, this is the materials that we have on hand to make a communicator, and that ended up inspiring a smartphone 60 years later.
Cat's carrying on upstairs.
Oh yeah, it's always we always have the cat interruption or dog interruption or something.
Yeah, that's always something. Yeah, sounds
but
like she's coming down.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of good ground here. I want to get close to ending. We'll call the cat a good way to end. Unless do you have anything to add to that?
I had a little glimmer of a thought, and then it just the loud yowl. So it's like.
Well, I'll say, do you have any plugs or promotions, like any videos that are coming up that you're excited about?
Well, I did one about a month ago on Larry Niven's A Cloak of Anarchy. It's really just examining kind of the basic underlying assumptions of anarchism. And several people asked me why I didn't talk about Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed in it. And the short answer was I originally did, but it felt a little disjointed, so I cut it out because I thought it deserved its own video. And that video is dropping this Friday. So that'd be cool if people check that out.
We'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
And for everybody at home, like I said, Matt is a lot bigger on YouTube, so I appreciate him coming to a small creator like me. Subscribe to him on YouTube, but he is also on Substack, so follow him there too.
Although I think I only have one thing on Substack right now. I keep meaning to post more substantive analysis of various things, but I never quite get around to writing it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people will post their videos as well, but in any case, I appreciate you coming on. So, but I always my little ending sign-off question, since oftentimes maybe it says something about my personality. We tend to get kind of gloom and doom, but since we're talking about sci-fi and the adventuring spirit, like what is something that makes you feel hopeful for the future? Like things are going to turn out okay, or like we have something to look forward to.
Yeah, I was going to grab the cat, but she ran off. Well, I guess like at the big picture level, it's that we've seen worse than this before. I mean, it's anything that's going on in the world right now is nowhere near the worst thing that humanity in general, of course, but even the United States as a political entity has endured. So it's like I'm not too worried about this being the collapse of America or the end of days or something. It's just we're going to weather this because it's just on the macro level not that bad. On a more personal level, I think that it's that I keep trying to maintain dialogue with people, people that I don't agree with on very much of anything, just because I think it is important to have the conversation, even if you don't think it's going to get anywhere, because every once in a while it does. But I have noticed, I think, like I mentioned earlier, that it seems like the absolutely, adamant zealot fringe is shrinking a little bit on both sides of that divide. And like increasingly now I'm able to sit and have conversations with not only mainstream Democrats, but like complete out there Marxist. I draw the line at the Stalin apologists, but it's like a few years ago, it was very rare to be able to have those kind of dialogues, and it's I've been able to have more of them recently, which I think is a good sign. Of course, it's anecdotal, but hopefully that reflects some kind of a wider trend of people seeing that the nice little prepackaged pat answers don't really hold up, and maybe it's time to kind of talk things out and do some of our own thinking again, see what we can arrive at.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and I think I would agree there. So, Matt, I really appreciate you coming on the show. This was a great conversation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Glad to be here.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yep, take care.